Hey guys, it's Sasha. We have a big surprise today because UK inflation unexpectedly rises to 18-month high of 3.6%. Nobody could have seen it coming. This was completely impossible to predict. Last week, I was making fun of every single major media company using the word unexpectedly when UK GDP shrank for the second month in a row. Today, every single big newspaper came out with the word unexpectedly again because inflation went up in June. Of course, in April, the new employers' national insurance increases hit businesses, and at the same time, minimum wage went up another 7% after already going up around 10% per year for the last 6 years, and there was a whole bunch of other changes, things that affected the hospitality industry in particular. Who could have guessed that prices would go up as a result? Nobody, of course, except random guys on YouTube. And when you look at the detailed data, I am sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it just gets worse. So CPIH, the real measure of inflation, has gone up from 4.0 to 4.1%. CPIH, remember, includes the cost of housing, which is ignored by the CPI measure. And you might look at that and say, well, it's only gone up 0.1%. That's nothing. You're just exaggerating the problem, Sasha. That's just noise. And, maybe you're right, but let me explain why I think it is a big problem. See this line here, which says housing and household services. It has gone down from 6.9 to 6.7%. And then just below, we have this line which says of which owner-occupiers costs, and this one went down from 6.7 to 6.4%. So at the moment, the way that they calculate the owner-occupier cost is by using a fake proxy rent equivalent. They're basically saying that because interest rates are going down or have been recently, the cost of mortgages, therefore, is also going down. They don't take the actual data from how much people are paying for mortgages. That would be too much work for the owners. No. You don't want to do work if you don't have to do it. And so their calculations are saying that part of inflation is going down because according to this data, rent and mortgages inflation is reducing. If you look at the detailed data, the weights of actual rentals for housing and owner-occupiers costs add up to 24%. So that means for every 0.4% that those costs move down, they drive the overall inflation number down by 0.1%. So at the moment, every single month, they are going down because there is a lag effect, because it's a lagging indicator. The reduction in interest rates has already happened. They just take time to catch up to that. So that means every month there is this new artificial downward pressure on inflation numbers. And a quarter is a very significant part of the total. So the inflation in that component, CPIH went down 0.3% in June for owner-occupiers costs because interest rates have come down. So that means that the overall inflation number has been suppressed down this month by almost 0.1%. So if inflation was flat, right, if prices did not move, if it did not improve or get worse, then because of the way that the owner-occupier cost metric is calculated and because of the lag effect in that and the rent data, the official inflation metric would still come down by 0.1%. Instead, it went up 0.2% for the CPI or 0.1% for CPIH. So in actual fact, that means inflation has accelerated by more, by 0.3% or 0.2%, depending on which measure you're talking about. But then look at the categories. Food inflation has ticked up from 4.4 to 4.5%. Alcohol and tobacco is up from 5.4 to 6.4%. Clothing and footwear is up from being negative to plus 0.5%. Then we have the housing costs, we've already talked about them. Then we have furniture and household goods, up slightly from 0.8 to 0.9%. Health down a tiny bit, basically flat at 4.4%. Transport also jumped up from 0.7 to 1.7% inflation. Communication is up, recreation and culture is up, education is flat, but it's very high still. It's at 7.5%. Remember that VAT on private schools, which is now costing the government money instead of making extra money from the tax because of the number of students who have moved into public schools as a result? Well, then we have restaurants and hotels. Now, this one is down from 2.8 to 2.6%, and that one is down because pubs and restaurants are in deep shit. We keep seeing in the jobs data every month that this is where the fastest loss of jobs has been happening. Prices are down because the industry is in big trouble and people aren't spending money in pubs or in hotels. For the first time ever, the local pub where I live has actually gone out and asked on social media the locals to come to the pub to support it because they're finding times to be really hard. So the problem with this inflation data is that it isn't one or two things that are driving the overall number, which has been the case previously. It's not like we have, I don't know, a specific energy crisis, right, where fuel has gone up massively or something else like that, which will eventually dissipate and normalize. No, what we're seeing is consistent increases in inflation right across the board, and that's a much worse problem. Consistent small increases every month are much harder to battle. It's very worrying. In June, the month before the new Labour government took office, inflation was at 2.8%. Now it's up at 4.1%, despite the owner-occupier costs dropping. They are now lower than they were a year ago. We are now seeing a very consistent increase in inflation in the UK that other countries are not seeing. Here is a chart of the UK inflation rate compared to the US inflation rate and the EU average inflation rate as the most obvious comparators. Back in 2022, the inflation problem was the same everywhere. Everyone was going through the spike because everyone panicked, everyone printed insane amounts of money during COVID, everyone dished it out to the people who didn't know how to spend it. Now, the UK is taking a very different economic path to other countries, with huge increases in public sector wages, an explosion of the welfare bill. The UK government is completely losing control of its finances. UK 10-year gilts are currently printing higher yields than at the peak of the Liz Truss fiasco. Remember that, when she was outlasted in office by letters? So at the moment, UK has a very unique problem with inflation because of the specifics of the UK economy and because of the specifics of what the UK government is doing or not doing about it. This stuff cannot be blamed on the macro. It can't be said that, everybody else is going through the same thing, because they are not. But it's not all bad news. You will be pleased to know that goat meat inflation has finally come down. I know you've been waiting for this update. It was at over 16% back in January, and it's now down to just 10% inflation. And for those of you who enjoy a bit of edible offal, times were tough back in January when it was up at 20% inflation, but guts and hearts and kidneys inflation has come down to just 7.3%. So, what is going to happen next? Well, the Bank of England has some hard thinking to do. The next meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee is in 3 weeks on the 7th of August. At the last meeting, the committee voted by 6 votes to 3 to keep the interest rate unchanged at 4.25%. And the problem we have is that interest rates have been climbing down while inflation has been coming up. And we're now at a place where the two are almost the same. The official rate of inflation, CPIH, is almost equivalent to the base rate. And in a month or two, they could switch. And typically, in order for the base rate to have a meaningful downward effect on inflation, historically, it has to sit at least 1% or 2% higher than the rate of inflation. But at the moment, the problem that we have is not people overspending, which is usually the cause for inflation. That's the issue, really, the big issue. The problem is not that the UK economy is just booming so hard, pumping so hard, right, that prices are going up because everyone has so much money to spend. Everyone goes on the high street and says, shut up and take my money, I want to buy all of your stuff. That is not what's happening. In fact, it's the opposite. The problem that we have at the moment is that government policies on tax, government policies on minimum wage, government policies on everything are forcing prices up, even though consumer demand is down, and even though businesses don't want to push prices up, but they are forced to because otherwise they would be losing money. So the Bank of England rate at the moment is having no meaningful effect. The Financial Times produces this neat chart for the retail sales index. So technically, when UK GDP growth is reported, that number is meant to be after Office for National Statistics strips out inflation. So that the nominal growth in GDP is higher than real growth, right? The word real just means that they have taken out inflation from the numbers. And when we talk about GDP growth, we always talk about the real GDP, the post-inflation, when you strip it out. But the thing is, although real GDP has been very, very slow in the UK in recent years, it is still on average just about positive over the last 6 years, even if very slightly positive. But we can see in the retail sales data that the reality of people's spending is different to what the GDP data is saying. The blue line is the volume of retail sales, so how many things people buy. And the pink line is the price of those things, if you like. And you can see that the price has been going up and up and up, and the amount of stuff that we buy in the UK is actually lower than it was back in 2019, which is 6 years ago. The UK population has grown over 3% in the same time period. So that means on a per person basis, people are buying something like 5% less stuff than they did 6 years ago. That's very, very significant in terms of the economics. That stuff just happens to cost a lot more money. So it looks like, the economy is doing well, more money is being spent. And now we have this new inflation data. It just means that same stuff is going up in price even faster. But unlike 2021 and unlike 2022, people can't afford to actually buy the stuff. At the moment, most analysts are expecting more rate cuts from the Bank of England to try and stimulate the economy. But the problem now is that dropping rates can make this inflation problem even worse. If it's easier to borrow money, prices tend to go up, and when interest rates on savings dip, it encourages saving less and spending more. So the Bank of England is in a bit of a catch-22 situation because the economy does need stimulating because it is in trouble, but the UK government is doing everything in their power to destroy that same economy in ways that cannot be solved by reducing the interest rate. And you know what I found particularly amusing in this inflation report? It's this line here in the opening section. Transport, particularly motor fuels, made the largest upward contribution to the monthly change in both CPIH and CPI annual rates. So according to the statisticians who work at the Office of National Statistics, the reason inflation went up and the reason inflation is higher than it should be is because of petrol prices. Here is a chart of petrol prices in the UK from the RAC. You can see that yesterday petrol was at 134.6p, and actually last month it was a little bit lower. And exactly 1 year ago it was 145.2p. Inflation is measured on an annual basis compared to prices from a year ago. Petrol is currently 6% cheaper than it was a year ago, and last month it was even more cheap. So the reason that inflation is going up is not because of petrol prices. It's a very, very common mistake to make if you don't know anything about statistics. If you're a dweeb pretending that you know statistics, but you actually don't, you just work for the Office of National Statistics, which is probably why the ONS just keeps making this mistake over and over. Petrol prices are currently exerting a negative effect on inflation. If petrol prices were exactly the same today as they were a year ago, then inflation overall would be higher. Petrol prices are currently reducing inflation, but petrol prices today are cheaper, so it means that they are driving the overall inflation rate down. Now, in May, petrol prices were driving inflation down more than they did in June, right? So in May, petrol inflation was minus 11%, and in June, it was minus 9.5%. Not quite as negative. So the downward effect from petrol is less in June than it was in May. But it's still a downward effect. It is a negative contribution. The reason that inflation is positive, the reason that inflation is going up, is because prices on everything else are going up. It's not because of petrol. It's a bit like a person who goes to the gym 7 days a week, right? Then next month, they only go to the gym 6 days a week, and they put on a load of weight. Now, the reason that they put on a load of weight is not because they went to the gym only 6 times instead of 7 times a week. It's because they were eating pizza, drinking beer every day, whatever. That's the reason. The gym is a negative contributor to weight gain, just like petrol prices are negatively contributing to inflation at the moment. Saying that going to the gym 6 times a week is the reason that you're fat is fucking stupid. Saying that petrol prices are the reason for inflation going up is equally stupid. And whoever it is in the ONS who publishes these reports and write these, you should be ashamed of yourself. Please, just resign. Just get the fuck out of there. Go back to study some mathematics. It's really interesting. I've done it. You should do it too. Go and learn some so that you don't embarrass yourself by publishing bullshit ever again. This level of gaslighting in the reports is disgusting. You know why inflation is actually going up? is because council tax bills are up over 5% on average, at least 5% for everyone in the UK. Inflation is up because businesses have to pay much higher minimum wage and much higher employees' national insurance, and therefore have to raise prices in order to not go bankrupt. Inflation is up in the UK because water bills are up 30, 40 or 50%. The official data says it's just 26% on average. I am somehow struggling to believe that average based on all of the anecdotal data from all the different water companies, but even at 26%, that's still an absurdly high number. Inflation is up because electricity prices are up 7% compared to last year. They refuse to come down. Despite whatever's been happening with energy prices, they're still way elevated compared to pre-2020. Inflation on food has gone up by more than 2 times in the last 6 months. Train ticket inflation is at almost 10%, which is completely insane given there is next to no improvement of the train service in the UK. Postal service inflation is at 7%, and it's only the non-essential stuff where prices are not going up. Everything that you have to buy, prices are skyrocketing because people can choose to not buy non-essential things. And what that means is the overall rate of inflation is suppressed because the weights do not change through the year. If people stop buying non-essential items, they still have the same exact weight in inflation data. But you can't choose to not use the train to go to work. You can't choose not to buy food for your family. You can't choose not to pay for your electricity. So for example, audio-visual equipment has inflation at just 0.6%, almost zero. It's gone up from last month, but still basically at zero because you don't need to buy a new TV. The old one that you have, where the screen has those weird vertical green lines on it and 2 buttons on the remote don't really work, is just fine. It does the job. The other recreational items, gardens and pets section is at 1.3% inflation because you don't need to buy new board games or new sports equipment. You can just make do with what you've got. Hotels are actually negative. They're down 1.9%. Negative inflation. Prices going down because nobody can afford to go on holiday. You can see the pattern, right? Things that you can choose to not buy, inflation on those things is very low because the people selling those things have no choice. They have to keep bringing the prices down so that at least somebody buys them. Things that you have to buy, inflation is very high. Look at cars as a good example. New cars inflation is at 3.1%. A little elevated, below the average of CPIH. Second-hand cars are at 1.1%. But then spare parts inflation is at 5% and maintenance and repairs is up at 7.3%. Because you don't have to replace your car if it's not completely dead, if you can still drive it, but you do have to service your car. You have to fix things that break so that you can keep driving it. You have to keep replacing the brake pads and stuff, right? This inflation report is showing major cracks in the UK economy. Sorry for the doom and gloom. I know a lot of people make the comment, but that's just what the numbers are showing. Don't shoot the messenger. Stay tuned for more updates. Make sure you subscribe to this channel to get them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.